Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Tenpenny Files. I'm your host, Dr. Sherri Tenpenny. The Tenpenny Files isn't just another podcast. I hold daily discussions with guests whose research has discovered evidence that challenges official narratives commonly seen in the headlines. Topics span the spectrum from national government history, astronomy, and travel to food and fitness, to vaccines, health, and health policy. And we talk every week to authors who write about faith and biblical principles. I want to introduce you to topics you've never heard of and topics you wish you'd had more time to explore. We want to give you a list of places of references of where you can go to do your own research and dig in. For listeners ready to question mainstream stories they've been told, the Tenpenny Files is the show for you. Join me each day at 3 p.m. Eastern Time to hear from authors and documentary filmmakers who have something important to say, but have often been silenced and censored. And before I introduce you to today's guest, I want to encourage my listeners to become a Tenpenny Prime member. You will benefit from a monthly white paper, recorded presentation, and an Ask the Expert masterclass that I bring in the best experts from all over the world, and they are over the moon good. Go to primemembership.drtenpenny.com, click on the tab, and you will learn more, and hopefully you will join us and support our work. Today's conversation is with the pastor from the Center of Executive Leadership in Birmingham, Alabama, George Shamblin, about his book, The Four Faces of Christ, which offers a unique exploration of Jesus through the distinct perspectives of the four Gospels. George, welcome to our new show, the Tenpenny Files. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
As always, it's a treat and an honor, so thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's so good to talk to you again. George, in your book, The Four Faces of Christ, you ask readers at the beginning of your book to envision a four-way intersection where a wreck happened. How is this similar to envisioning the four Gospels?
Yeah, if you think about an accident, let's say you're on a busy intersection in Manhattan, we could say, and there's this collision that takes place. Well, investigators of police show up and they start interviewing different people to say, what did you see? Well, if one person is up close on a street corner, they may have seen everything unfold right in front of them. Somebody else may have looked over their shoulder. Somebody else may have been down the street. They all have different perspectives of the same event, but they add color. They add necessary, needed information. And in fact, what would be very suspicious is if you interviewed four different people and there was, something that they were complicit in doing and they gave the exact same story, you'd go, now, wait a minute, this sounds real familiar. In other words, that wouldn't be as credible. The differing versions that are seeing the same event would make you say, okay, it depends on where they were standing and what their perspective was, to present the facts.
Yeah, that's really, really good way to think about it because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are really telling the same story. But when you read each one of the Gospels, you get a different view of what Jesus said, of what the culture was doing, and things like that. In fact, how did the backgrounds of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John influence their portrayals of Jesus?
Well, if you think about the Apostle Paul, he said that he became all things to all men so that he might win some. He said, to the Gentile, I became a Gentile. To the Jew, I became a Jew. In other words, he had the same content, which was the gospel, but he may have a different way to present the gospel to different audiences. For instance, if you and I are talking to different groups, we could have the same message, but if we're talking to junior high kids, we may speak, a little differently the way we're communicating that information as opposed to a group of professors at a university. And in the same way with the gospel writers, they have different audiences that they're trying to reach. And so they'll use nuances to reach that audience. If I'm speaking in biblical times to a Jewish audience or a Gentile audience, well, there's going to be some differences. The Gentile audience wouldn't know if I said, well, the Torah says, they'd say, what is the Torah? So I'd have to kind of unpack that. We see all these different kind of sub narratives that are taking place in the Gospels. They're there, but I just wanted to bring those out in this book.
You say that although Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do not explicitly sketch out Jesus's physical appearance, there's something specific that they intend for us to perceive about his physicality, and sometimes it's just so neat for me, for lack of a better word, to think about Jesus and his humanness, because we elevate him to worship him as, as the God King that he is, but somehow his physicalness and his humanness means so much more to know that he really experienced the things that we go through in life. He fell down, he walked long distances, probably got blisters on his feet, all those sorts of things. What did the Gospels want us to perceive about his physical appearance?
Well, it's really interesting. We do not get any descriptions of what Jesus physically looked like. The closest we get, I would say, in Isaiah, we're told that he was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, but it says that he didn't have any stately form or majesty that we would be drawn to him. In other words, and this is so hard to think about, but it's what the Bible teaches, if we're standing there in biblical times and we see, 1,000 Jews, and somebody said, which one's the Messiah? We would not have seen a blue-eyed, wavy-haired Jesus that would have stood out. He looked like other Hebrews. And that's just hard for us to imagine. Jesus was probably not as tall as we think. His appearance would be a little different than we think. But here's the point. It was the message, it was the content, it was what he did on the cross. That was the emphasis rather than outward appearance. Obviously, because we just don't get any indication what Jesus looked like.
And why do you think that is?
Well, that's a good question. How would I answer that? Why do we not get his? I'll have to think about that. I mean, I would say, Um, I really don't know. I think maybe it's because if you remember his audience at the time, so many people wanted him to be this royal, majestic king, and maybe with that his like with George Washington, when George Washington walked into a room, he had this immediate respect because he was taller, he was kind of a larger than life figure, and so he did stand out with his physical appearance. With Jesus, we're told he didn't. And so we say, okay, what makes him special? The fact that he was the Son of God, the fact that he was God, the fact that he died for our sins. It's a great question to ask, though. I wish people would respond back and let me know their thoughts and let you know their thoughts as well.
Well, there were so many people that saw him, thousands and thousands of people. And then there are sort of the Gnostic texts, that were, like Enoch and Jubilees, and then there are a lot of other historical texts that were happening at the time. You would have thought somebody somewhere would have said he was about 5'8", average build, brown hair. You know what I mean? You would have thought somebody would have done that. There is an entire school of thought that kind of comes out of Russia about the Black Jesus, and that there are a lot of, what do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, sure. He wasn't a white Jesus. He wasn't a black Jesus. He wasn't a Latino Jesus. He was, Middle Eastern descent. He was fully Hebrew. And so, I think all of our depictions, honestly, we kind of want to make Jesus in our own image, let's face it. And we have this mental perception of what he should look like, but that doesn't mean that's what he did look like. We all do that though, If you look around the world at different depictions of Jesus that came much later, I mean, really, for 300 years, we don't have really much art that even tried to portray who he was. But we all kind of give him some, characteristics that look a little more like us. We really do.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, in your book, The Four Faces of Christ, one of the things that you say is that you write that Mark's gospel always causes you great sorrow. Why is that?
If people will start reading Mark and almost say, you know what, I'm going to put aside so much of what I know. I just want to read the story. And if they would focus on one thing, and that is the loneliness of Jesus, not only is he misunderstood, people just can't really connect with who he is, what his mission is. But here's where it gets sad. If you and I are in our moment of dire need, and Dr. T, you've had those moments in your life where maybe you felt like the whole world walked out and you needed a friend who walked in. Okay. We've all had those moments. And so with Jesus in his moment of trial, his moment of needing people to come alongside, instead they start peeling off. His family, as you continue reading in Mark, his family peels off. The masses peel off. All the people that he healed, the masses that he fed, the teaching, all of these things, everybody peels off. Eventually, he has the disciples that peel off. He has one that betrays him with a kiss. He has another that denies him 3 times. By the time we get to the cross, we've really got some women there, his mother and some other women. We've got John. That's it. Here's the thing, though. When Jesus is on the cross, the ultimate turning away, and we miss this a lot of time, God had to actually turn away from Christ. A holy God cannot come in contact with sin, and our sin was put on the cross. And so when God turned his face away from Jesus, there's that total separation. It is just Jesus on the cross. And I want people to notice when Jesus says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He's not saying my Father. He's not referring the more affectionate term. It's this more distant, this more benign, because God had turned away. God really did turn away. And it's just sad. If I can add one other thing, a lot of people miss this. When Jesus was on the cross, he's got his mother, he's got Mary Magdalene, he's got these other ladies. He didn't have on any clothing. And you think the humiliation of his arms being nailed to a cross, you can't even, it's our nature to want to cover. And the fact that Jesus couldn't even cover himself in front of his mother and others, that's just so humbling. That makes me very sad. It makes me really sad. So I think we see the loneliness of Jesus in Mark's gospel more than anywhere else.
And I think that a lot of people miss the fact that Jesus knew what was coming. I mean, he was sent on a mission. He knew what the end game was going to be. And when he was in the garden praying, Lord, if it be thy will, take this away from me. I've read in a lot of different places, he wasn't saying, don't let me be tortured and nailed to a cross. He knew that God was going to separate himself from him.
That's exactly right. And it's that separation that throughout you and I understand time. And there's a beginning and there's an end. With God, there's no beginning, there's no end. It's hard for us to understand. But before time began, after time ends, if you will, over, underneath time, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit have been united. Okay, they have been inseparable. And for the first time, for 6 hours, there was this separation where God really did turn away. And Jesus was human. That hurt. And I think you're exactly right that that's when Jesus is saying, let this cup pass. The physical pain and suffering, of course, Jesus, I'm sure that was brutal, but it was that ultimate separation from God that was unbearable, yet he bore it. He was able to bear that because of his great love with which he loved us. And if I can add something too, at one point, Jesus says at the Last Supper, he says, with passionate longing, I have passionately longed. That's how the Greek reads. With passionate longing, I have passionately longed to have this meal with you. We think, wait a minute. Why would somebody have this passionate longing to to have this moment with the disciples knowing what's coming? It's because of his great love. And he knew that for us to be saved and to be reconciled with God, he had to do what he had to do. And to think, boy, he had with passionate longing and he passionately longed for that moment. That is love at its core. That is unbridled love that Jesus manifests even in the upper room.
Wow. And and to think that they trotted around with him for 3 years and they had all kinds of meals with him. And yet after he died, they were like, well, maybe, okay, I guess I'll go back to being a fisherman. What Peter said, like they still didn't get it. They still didn't really understand. It was over time. I think that during Paul's missionary journeys, that things really started to come together for them. We think 2,000 years later, wouldn't it just be magnificent to sit down around a campfire and chat with Jesus? And they've been doing this for 3 years and they still didn't get it. But we get it all these years in retrospective review, which I think is just amazing when it comes to our faith, of how all of these years it's been persistent and grown over time. You say in the Gospel of Jews, I'm sorry, in the Gospel of Luke, that it captures Jesus' affinity for the down and outers. How does that change? And where do you see that?
It's just everywhere. I'll give you an instance. You have somebody who is hurt and they're, laying in a street, and you have the priest, Jesus tells the parable, who walks on one side, the Pharisee who walks on another, but it's a Samaritan. And I mean, the Jews would have thought, wait a minute, the Samaritan's going to be the hero of the story. That would almost be comparable to somebody telling us today that a member of ISIS was the hero. People would say, wait, how could a member of ISIS be a hero? That's the disdain the Jews had for Samaritans. And yet, in Jesus' story in Luke's gospel, it's not just a good person who helps the person in need, it's a Samaritan, not only a Samaritan, Jesus says a good Samaritan. I think people don't really grasp how offensive, how shocking that would have been to Jews to have a story about a good Samaritan. But the point is, it's the Samaritans that were overlooked, not just the man who was, hurt lying on the street in that parable, but it's the Samaritans. It's women. Women were sometimes seen in their communities as second class citizens. The first two chapters of Luke, the first two chapters, who are the prominent figures? Women. It's all, for the vast majority of it, is about women. And so that's in Luke's gospel. He brings women to the fore. Who made up Jesus' support team? Luke is going to tell us it was these women out of their private means. We have the first two chapters. We have the star witness of the resurrection, a woman. We have tax collectors. We have Samaritans. We have the lame. At the end of the day, and Luke brings this out, when Jesus says he didn't come for those who are well, but for those who are sick and need a physician. In Luke's gospel, it's the people who realize they have a sickness and they want healing that come to Jesus. It's the ones that think, hey, we're good, that totally miss out.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, you've told us now, you've given us a perspective on Mark and a perspective on Luke. What are your thoughts about Matthew and John?
Yeah, Matthew's just really the best way to say it. He is a Jewish man writing to a Jewish audience about a Jewish Savior. The very first verse, he's going to connect Jesus to two heroes of Judaism, and that's David and Abraham. And he quotes, I think it's maybe 41 times, I think he quotes from the Old Testament. He's going to make the point that this long awaited Jewish Messiah that you've been waiting on, well, guess what? He's come and his name's Jesus, and I'm going to present him to you. So there's a very strong, as a professor of mine said, Jewish flavor. Matthew's gospel is just Jewish flavor all over the place. Jewish customs, Jewish culture, Jewish language, Jewish verbiage. It's just a very Jewish flavor for a Jewish audience for the most part. John, John is just John. It's almost like swimming on the surface of water, snorkeling, and you keep trying to go touch the bottom and you can't get there. You keep thinking, I'm eventually going to get to the bottom over some coral reef or something. John's gospel, you just can't reach the bottom, the depth and the breadth. is so deep. We're to try to the best of our ability, we just can't quite get there because it's so profound.
And when John really does, when I read through the Gospels, John to me is like almost a separate book. It doesn't
Mhm.
really have the same flavor as the other. It could almost be like you could almost take it out of the Bible and just have it be a standalone book because of the love that it talks about and the communication. It has a completely different flavor. What is your take? Do you agree with that? What is your take on that?
I really do. If you read John's gospel, people are not going to get John's gospel until you understand that Jesus is speaking in spiritual terms and everybody else is thinking and speaking and responding in physical terms. We could call that eternal versus temporal. Those are just big ways of saying that he's talking about spiritual truths, they're talking about physical truths. For instance, he meets a lady at a well. He says, "You can have this water that you don't have to come again, and it can be water springing from your innermost being." What does the woman say? She's saying, "Our father Jacob, built this. How do I get this water?" Jesus talks about a place to worship. The woman says, "Well, are you supposed to worship physically over here in Jerusalem or over here? I think it's Mount Gerizim." And Jesus is saying, again, she's thinking this way horizontally. Jesus says, "No, we can worship the Father in spirit and truth right here, right now." It's everywhere in John's gospel. People are thinking this, and Jesus is speaking like this, and they're not, on the same wavelength. And so that's one of my favorite things about John's gospel.
Why do you think the Samaritans, or do we know why the Samaritans were so hated by the Jews?
Yes, during the dispersion and the captivities that took place, a lot of people from Samaria were left behind. Let's see, the Assyrians took away the 10 northern tribes, the Babylonians took away the 2 southern tribes. A lot of people in the Samaria region remained behind and they started marrying Gentiles. And so that's why the Jews, and this is awful, but this is what they would say they were half breeds or inbred. And so that's when the dissension took place. And then eventually the Samaritans are going to build their own temple, which outraged the Jews. And so that divide just became more and more broad over time. That's why they would say they were half breeds. They saw them as worse than a dirty Gentile dog, is what they would say. So a lot of really terrible hatred there.
Wow, I had no idea. Sometimes people get disparaging about extra biblical texts. And I think that somehow they feel like it takes away from the message and takes away from the Bible. But I think that a lot of extra biblical texts add to, and they tell you more about what people ate at the time, what their living circumstances were. I'm, reading a book that really talks about Paul's journeys, and it digs down. It's got 2,500 references. It's about this,
Mm-hmm.
and it talks
Mm-hmm.
about Antioch and how Antioch at the time was this huge megapolis. It was actually even bigger than Jerusalem, and the author describes it as being poor, dirty, and smelly. And so when you read that, you kind of can get the picture in your mind of what it was like to live in those days and why life expectancy was in the 20s and why, a fetal, I mean, the birth rate the death rate, at birth was so high, that the babies died and, they would do these things called exposure, where they would take the girl babies and just lay them out because they couldn't afford them. They couldn't feed them. And so this thing called exposure left them naked so that they would either die from exposure or by animals would eat them or something like that. Kind of
Mm-hmm.
like how we disparage the Chinese for, the one child thing. But it was happening for centuries, for 1,000 years of what was happening. So I think when we bring in those extra things from outside and understand what the living conditions were like, what the antagonisms were between these different groups, it brings the Bible alive. It makes it more than just something you're reading. It gives it context in terms of what the people were like when they were living during that time. I listened to an interview by oh gosh, I'm so bad with names sometimes. He played Jesus in The Chosen.
Oh, sure. I know who you're talking about. Right.
Whatever his last name was. Anyways, one of the questions that was asked him on this interview was, what did you think about, playing that role? And he said, man, those first century humans were tough. They were tough people of what they had to, fight for food and shelter. And, they
Right.
walked everywhere. Like a 30-mile walk was like a 4-day journey. It's just a whole different way to think about things.
Mm-hmm. You know, and so much what you're talking about, just the big expression we use for that is the grammatical historical context. And that's why people will sometimes say, why does the pastor focus on what the Greek or the Hebrew is? But there's so much additional color when we learn here's what this word meant at the time. And I mean, you and I talked about John earlier. John uses three different words for love. Well, there's a huge difference between unconditional, people have maybe heard agape love, versus phileo, which is brotherly love. Philadelphia comes from phileo. So again, it's kind of historical, grammatical context. And then we have eros. And it's kind of important to know which of those terms is used where. God does not have a brotherly love towards us. He has agape. That means no strings attached. Believers have a brotherly love, and by God's grace, we're able to grow into unconditional love. So it's just there's so much to bring out with the grammatical historical. And one thing you said too, we have an Old Testament, we have a New Testament. There was this intertestamental time of about 420 years. We have some intertestamental literature that was written, Maccabees and others. I love that you said there's a lot of information there. And so here's what a lot of the reformers said. During the Reformation, they said that intertestamental literature, it's very inspiring, but it's not inspired. So
Mhm.
that's what I would say. There's a lot of literature out there that, can kind of shed some light on what was going on at the time. So it's inspiring, it's informative, but it's not inspired. And that's a big difference between the two.
That's very good and very true. And it really does bring context to the things. So I think this is a good place for us to take a short break. Hold that thought, George. We'll be right back to talk more. We're going to take a short break to hear from our sponsors on AmericaOutloud.news. America Out Loud Talk Radio plays the Tenpenny Files on the iHeartRadio network daily at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. You can also listen anywhere in the world by going to AmericaOutloud.news and hopping onto their media player. And if you've missed any of these great conversations that we've been having, you can find the Tenpenny Files on Spotify, Pandora, Apple, TuneIn, iHeart Virtual Studios, and on any of my platforms, which is drtenpenny.com and drtenpenny.substack.com. We also play them on X and Rumble and Instagram. There's so many great books out there and so many wonderful documentaries and so little time to read and watch with our busyness in our lives that this show is meant to maximize your time and jumpstart your interest. We have a great message from our sponsors that are coming up. Please listen closely. Sit tight. We will be right back with more conversation with George Shamblin about his book, The Four Faces of Christ. Zeolite is a detox spray. We work specifically with a company called Touchstone Essentials. They are an incredible company. We've been working with them now for several years. And zeolite is a mineral that goes through your body like a one-way basket. It will clean out heavy metals such as arsenic and mercury, aluminum, cadmium, and it hooks onto those metals from a one-way perspective. So once it's bound, it goes out through your urine or your stools and doesn't get redeposited in other places. Everybody needs to have a detox product in their life, and this one is so easy to use and it's so safe. You can take it when you're pregnant, you can take it when you're nursing, you can give it to little children, you can even give it to infants, and quite frankly, I give it to my dog. I actually put a little bit of the zeolite in his water because until we all stop living in a toxic world, we all need to get some of those extra toxicities out, the heavy metals, the persistent organic pollutants, the things that are floating through the air, the different things that we come in touch with in our environment. And we are a big fan of zeolite. from Touchstone Essentials. We've been a big fan of their products for several years. Go to drtenpenny.com/detox to get your first bottle of Zeolite spray for $50 off.
Well, only when the government bows to the people will America become great again. This is Malcolm Out Loud here. Join me in pushing back against censorship, my fellow Americans. Right at the top of AmericaOutloud.news are the words: many voices, one freedom, united in the First Amendment. Now is our time, my fellow Americans. AmericaOutloud.news, liberty and justice for all.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Today we're talking with George Shamblin, pastor of the Center for Executive Leadership in Birmingham, Alabama, and his book, The Four Faces of Christ. Let me tell you just a little bit more about today's guest. In 1996, George Shamblin left a career in pharmaceutical sales to enroll at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. After graduation, he planted a church in Pensacola, Florida, and has served there for many years. Since 2012, George Shamblin has been a pastor at the Center for Executive Leadership in Birmingham, Alabama, where he teaches Bible studies and disciples others in various stages of spiritual growth. He served on the board of Real Life International and taught as an adjunct professor at Birmingham Theological Seminary. In 2023, he and his brother Keith co-founded a missions ministry to Cuba, the Oversee Initiative. He's written several books and has recently been inducted into the Marquee Who's Who. George, welcome back to the show. We're so grateful to have you here today. Let's change gears a little bit. You've been with the Center for Executive Leadership since 2012. How has this role evolved over the years, and what do you find most fulfilling about that job?
Okay, we've got a men's ministry here in Birmingham, Alabama, and we've branched out to Memphis, and we're looking at branching out to a city in Texas and some other places as well. And so we all do men's ministry. Our common theme is we do one-on-one evangelism, discipleship. We have group Bible studies. And then every man up here kind of has a little area that we like to spend extra time in. For me, it's missions. We have somebody else that does some inner city work. Another person, prison ministry, fatherhood coaching, counseling, premarital. So it's just kind of a whole gamut of men's ministry. You asked the question, though, how have things developed over time? Really interesting that you should ask. I think it's great for us to study the Bible. Many people who are tuning in, maybe in a Bible study, and that's great. But at some point, what if we turned our chairs around? And so one development I've had really recently is telling all the men in the Bible study, right? They get a pledge pen, and here it is. I just happen to have mine in my pocket. The sword of the Spirit, okay, the Bible. The first time a man in a Bible study shares his faith with somebody else in some form or fashion, they get their little pledge pen with our secret fraternity, okay? And then if you don't share the gospel with somebody the next week, you have to turn it back in. And then if you share the week after, you get it back. And so the hope is this reminds us to turn our chairs around and share with others what we're learning in a circle. We're having fun with it. Guys are saying they're getting out of their comfort zone, but it's pretty cool that you have this little sword out there, and people are like, I want to get that sword. I want to keep it on my person. So that's been really fun. That's something we're doing now to share how we've sort of evolved. It's been an absolute blast.
That's really cool. It's such a physical manifestation of what you're doing and a reminder. That's really a cool way to encourage all of us to share the gospel, the good news of what it means to have a relationship with Jesus. I think that's really cool.
And if I can share something, listen, if we can get a gospel presentation with somebody from A to Z, fine. But if we can just kind of sprinkle conversations with gospel. My favorite question to ask people, I was at Cracker Barrel I hated that they changed their logo, but that's another story. I was at Cracker Barrel the other day, and Kiki, I think was our waitress's name. And I had on a shirt that said, "How can I pray for you today? Stop me and I'll pray for you." I've worn it a few times. And anyway, she said something about my shirt. I said, "Well, Kiki, how can I pray for you?" She told me. And then through what she told me about her son and, raising him in the faith, I was able to write down some verses. I was able to challenge her. I said, "Hey, can I pray for you right here? Let's not worry about anybody else. What if I pray for you right here?" So even something like that, did I get to share the gospel from A to Z? No. But was I able to leave her with some verses, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 that I wrote down, and 2 Corinthians 5:17? Sure. And so that's just a little step. But here's the thing. Those opportunities exist every single day. But if we don't have a little reminder like this, and we're not challenging people on a regular basis to actually put it into practice, we're just not going to do it as much. Uh, if I can just share one more thing, I've got my Bible study on Wednesday night, and which is tomorrow, and I was getting my oil change, and I thought, wait, I hadn't shared with anybody. I got to practice this myself. And so there was a young man at Express Oil, and he told me what his name was. It was a biblical name. And I said, "Man," and I started asking his story, where he was from, and sharing some verses. So it was just a little bit, but it was enough for me to keep my pledge pin for the week. And we've had a ton of fun. But if I could challenge people in your audience, I got these little bad boys on Amazon. I think they're 50 cents a piece. People really want these, okay? And if it takes this to get people to share their faith, so be it.
And what you just said is so important, that the little sprinkle here and there is such a better way to have a conversation with people about anything, whether you're talking about the gospel and your faith, whether you're talking about politics, whether you're talking about vaccines, whether you're talking about anything. A little drop, a little seeds, planting little seeds, because what people want to do, particularly if they're excited, maybe they're new Christians and they're really super excited, you tend to want to vomit all over them. You want to tell them everything you've ever learned and known, and everything you've ever read, anything you've ever written. And people are like, "Wait a minute. Get me out of here. Get me away from this crazy person." And so those little seed droppings is such a beautiful way to share your faith with others.
And I'm so glad that you said that, because when I'm getting my oil changed, we're not used to this down south. It was 20 degrees and the guy was cold, and out of common courtesy, I wasn't just going to share all these things like you said. It was short, it was sweet, and it was just a little sprinkle. It's just a little touch here and there. And I think those opportunities are there every single day, but we're not looking for them. And a lot of times maybe we're looking for them, but we're not jumping on them. And, it can be something just little. Here's my approach recently in Alabama. Pretty much everybody's a Christian. If you ask them, I mean, I think it's like 90% of people will tell you they are a born again Christian. Well, obviously that's not the case. Let's be honest. And so my favorite things, I say, "Do you mind if I ask you something?" So I'm always asking permission. "Is it okay if I ask you something?" Yes. I'll say, in Alabama, I feel like you got people, one of three groups. You've got churchgoers, kind of sit in church, other people just not interested in Christianity. And I'm not here to judge, but that's kind of another group. And another group are full on Jesus lovers. If you don't mind me asking, so I say it twice, which of those three are you? Dr. Tenpenny, what shocks me is how quick people tell you which one they are.
Really?
It's fascinating. Very rarely does somebody have to go, "Oh, let me think about it." People say, "I'm somewhere, I'm kind of figuring things out." And I say, "Man, that's awesome. Can I just challenge you with one thing?" And my challenge is always, would you just read a chapter of the Gospel of Luke every day and just say, "Jesus, show me who you are and what you have, what plan you have for my life." That's really not that awkward. It's not weird. I'm not putting somebody in a corner. I'm just saying, "Hey, thank you for sharing that with me." If they're a Jesus lover, I say, "Man, that's awesome. Tell me your story if you can. I love to hear that." If they're indifferent, I'll say, "No problem. But would you be willing just to look a little bit by reading the gospel?" So anyway, that to me is what I do. It depends on who I talk to, how far we go, but at least it kind of broaches the subject. People are so receptive. You'd be shocked how receptive people are, and they don't mind you asking, surprisingly.
Such great advice. And it's really true that if you start conversations with a question, instead of telling people, you're asking people. And when you ask people, you're inviting them into a dialogue instead of feeling like you're hammering them with something. We used to do classes years ago. We used to do these classes called Mastering Vaccine Info. And it was a 6-week course, and every other week was something about vaccines. And on the opposite weeks, the person I was doing this with was doing language training on how do you talk to people about difficult topics. If your mother-in-law is a nurse and your father-in-law is a pediatrician, how do you broach the topic with them about vaccines? And it was always about asking a question. Did you know? Have you ever read? What do you think about? And things like that. And sharing, gospel messages with people, that's the same way. It's such a beautiful thing. Thank you for sharing that, because that's just really beautiful.
And I really never get into the responses. Like if somebody says, I'm just kind of doubting right now, instead of me just immediately saying, you shouldn't doubt and da da da, I say, you know what, I get it. But God's big enough to take your doubts. That's okay. Share with God your doubts. I mean, even the disciples at times doubted. Even doubt itself can basically, it's an indication that there's some faith there. So I'm not, just you shouldn't doubt and all this. It's like, hey, that's okay. A lot of times the conversation ends right there. And so this gives people the freedom to just have a natural, like you said, I love it. Just ask a question and let them talk through and say, hey, thank you for sharing with me. I'd ask you to consider this, but that's between you and God. Thank you for letting me ask. You can beat all of 1 minute, really can.
And sometimes that's the best. My entire life of all the vaccine work that I've done, it's been based on the parable of the sower. Some sow seeds, some fall on rocky soil, some get choked out by the weeds, some get scorched by the sun. 1 in 4 seeds lands on good soil and grows up and bears fruit. So that's 25% of your effort is really fruitful. You're probably not going to do better than the Bible. You're probably not with your sowing seeds. But you never know which seed gets the attention. You never know where the good soil is. And you have absolutely no control over how long it takes for that to sprout and to grow. So our job is just to continually sow seeds. And by dropping those little Bible verses, asking those little questions, you've probably had more success with that than standing up and giving an hour sermon on Sunday.
Could not agree more.
Yeah, it's really great. Well, let's ask you one other thing about sowing seeds, which is how much time you spend in Cuba. Tell us about your missionary work in Cuba.
Sure. The gospel is absolutely exploding in Cuba. They just don't have anything contrary to popular belief where people say they have free health care. Please don't say that. Please do not say they have free health care. They have no health care. People say they have free food. Please don't say that. They have no free food. Communism promises all sorts of untruths, and they never come true. They never produce. They just don't produce. So there's a void there. The beauty is the gospel is sprouting like crazy. I basically like to picture it where people's palms are empty because the government and society has made so many unfulfilled promises that a lot of people are saying, okay, where do I turn? And quite frankly, a lot of times, it's like one of the disciples said to Jesus, where else are we going to go? Oh, don't you love that? You have the words of eternal life. That was either Thomas or Peter. I can't remember. And it's the same thing in Cuba. They're saying, where else do we go? And so converts are just happening all the time. Please pray for the people of Cuba. Things are going to get worse before they get better. It's a matter of time, but I got to be careful going too far because I share this on a lot of platforms, and we got to be careful because I don't want to be prevented from going to Cuba in the next couple of months. But put it this way, things are going to change, not a year or years from now, within months. Things are going to change for the better. they cannot get any worse. People don't have food. They're not able to eat. It's illegal to fish. It's illegal to fish. It's an island. And unless you get a permit, well, nobody can afford the permit. And so people who are going hungry can't eat because the communist government wants to control the food source. And so it's evil. It is just as evil can be. It's run its course, and this thing is over. It's just a matter of months. And the hope is that some godly people get put in big positions that are more about the gospel than anything else. So that's our prayer.
I don't understand the politics of that nation. That all of this kind of antagonism between Cuba and the United States, as I was just reading about this for some other thing, started in the late 1950s. And
right.
we had the whole Bay of Pig things in 1963. So we're talking, 60 years ago, we have this island, beautiful country just off of our shores. What is making that continue, that antagonism continue?
It's over. It is over. I'm telling you, at the very top, is there 3 to 5% at the very top that are controlling the wealth and the power? Are they still supporting communism? Of course they are. I promise you, 95% or more of people are over it. They're sick of it. I spoke at a college conference one time, and I'm looking at all these young kids, and 2 years earlier, they're listening to what I'm saying, with the gospel and stuff. This time, they're not listening to word I'm saying. They're all scrolling on their phones, friends of theirs that had fled to America. And so it was kind of sad on the one hand, not because they weren't listening to me, but it's kind of like their focus had changed. But I asked all my older friends, I said, all these college kids, how many of them would go to America like today if they could? Every adult I asked said 100%. I said, what you mean? Every single kid in here. And they said, George, I'm telling you, if you could take them on a plane today, 100% would go. The older people, the military, they're sick of it. Even older communists that we've seen very hardened in the past, they are seeing the unfulfilled promises of communism. They're sick of it. We even talk to military, and when nobody's looking, they'll kind of lean over and say, thank you for what you're doing for our people. Or, hey, tell me, what it's like to live in America. It's over. The people are so over it, but they're so broken down. They are so demoralized. They've been pinned down for such a long time. I think some of that will to fight is not there. Those who did protest during COVID ended up getting arrested, put in prison, or worse. And so it's going to be hard for the change to come from the bottom up. But I think outside influences, it's a matter of months. The whole thing is over. Can I share one other thing? Are we okay?
We've got just minutes left, but go ahead.
I'll make it real quick. My wife and I went there to Havana 3 years ago, and we went this year. The degradation in 3 years was shocking. They were hanging on by a string last summer. Now, with other things that are taking place, that shoestring is not going to exist. So, because of Venezuela, that was the pipeline. Things are going to change very quickly.
Well, hopefully we'll keep those people in our prayers because, and really young people here in this country need to hear this story because they're the ones who are saying, well, we need to have socialist Marxism and communism, and we can make it work. It's just that the rest of you have never done it right, and we know how to do it, which tells me they've never read anything about history and all the people that have fled those sorts of nations.
The doctors are making $40 a month right now. If you're a medical doctor in Cuba, you make $40 a month. If you're an engineer, you make $35 a month. 2 dozen eggs is $30 a month. So,
Wow.
socialism is an absolute, it's a farce. It's a lie. If people don't believe me, go to Cuba. Just go down there. Poor politician out in California just the other day was talking about they have free health care. And I just want to call them up and say, you poor soul. They don't even have medicine down there. Why go to the doctor? They don't have anything. Please don't say they have free health care. They have no health care. I'm getting worked up, but anyway.
Well, that's good, George. We need that kind of passion to free people. So, in the last 2 or 3 minutes that we have here on the show today, we could talk for hours. Circling back to your book, The Four Faces of Christ, what is your take-home message about your book in general?
It is, there's so much deeper theology in the four gospels. And my hope is that I shined a light in the book on a few things that would help people go a little deeper in their understanding, maybe some things we've read before. I think there's some things that kind of are unearthed in there that have been in scripture all along, but sometimes to dissect it, like you said earlier, looking at the context, looking at some of the grammar, hopefully I bring some of that out.
That's beautiful. Where's the best place to buy your book, and how can we follow your work?
Okay. I promise people this is not a bait and switch. This isn't, there's nothing to this. I had somebody underwrite the cost of the book. I will ship them for free. We will pay for the shipping. We will give somebody a free book, and we're not selling you anything. All I ask is that people subscribe to a blog. That's it. And the blogs are never promoting or selling a single thing. We just want to get the message out there. So if people will go to georgeshamblin.com, it's also got my email on there. All they have to do is give address. We'll send them a free book. We pay for the shipping. We're not going to ask for a donation. We're not going to ask for anything. I'd just love to do that. So georgeshamblin.com, and you can reach out to us there.
And that's where the blog is? That's where
Yeah,
you're.
that's right. And I just, somebody always has an angle, and it's like, oh, please don't bait and switch. This is as straightforward as it can be. I give my word. We're not selling anything.
That is really beautiful. Well, I'll make sure that that's in the show notes so that everybody can get that and to get this book because it's really well written. It's a joy to read. It's a really pleasurable book to read, and it gives you insights into things that you probably didn't see before. That's why the Bible is so timeless, and you can read the same book of the Bible, the same gospels over and over and over again and read different commentaries and different books about it because it is so timeless. Oh, George, I want to thank you so much for being here with us today. I'll make sure that all that information gets into your show notes. And for everybody else, thank you for joining us here at the Tenpenny Files. I want to close out with one of my favorite verses from the Bible. I close all my podcasts with, whether they are live or pre-recorded, which is Romans 12:12. Rejoice in hope, be patient in trouble, and be persistent in prayer. Lean into God, trust Him for everything. He'll never let you down. We'll see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern or whatever day it is at the next time on AmericaOutloud.news and iHeartRadio. You can also listen to us on any of your favorite podcast platforms. You can find out more about me and our work and what we do by going to drtenpenny.com, where you can also find my book, Zero Accountability in a Failed System. Please subscribe to our Substacks, drtenpenny.substack.com and tenpennywalkwithgod.substack.com. They are totally free. We always welcome donations, but they are all free. I always say, if I'm going to take the time to write it, I want you to read it. So I don't put it behind a paywall or anything like that. And also, please, please, please follow us on X and Instagram at Busy Dr. T. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. We'll see you here tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern or the next time on the Tenpenny Files. Goodbye and God bless.